Landmark Supreme Court cases. First case, Marbury v. Madison, 1803. Marbury v. Madison was one of the most significant cases in the history of the U.S. The case was established when President John Adams was defeated by Thomas Jefferson in the 1800 election. President Adams filled up the Supreme Court with judges of his choice and were appointed on his last day of office. When Thomas Jefferson was sworn into office as president and James Madison as Secretary of State, they refused to deliver their many commissions from John Adams. One of Adams's commissions was to William Marbury. Mr. Marbury went on and sued James Madison for not delivering his commission. One of the major legal issues of this case is if the Supreme Court can rule on the constitutionality of the law passed by Congress. John Marshall argued that when the Constitution and a regular law were in discussion, something had to be done to the Constitution. In addition, it was the Supreme Court's job to interpret the law and the Constitution. In conclusion, the Supreme Court ruled the law as unconstitutional, laws that are invalid and may not be enforced, and established the principle of judicial review. Second case, Tinker v. Des Moines Independent School District, 1969. During the Vietnam War, a certain group of students from middle and high school in Des Moines, Iowa, petitioned the war by wearing black armbands to school. School administrators thought the armbands would cause a distraction to regular school schedules, so they banned the armbands days before the students started to wear them. The students argued that this violated their First Amendment right of freedom of speech. One of the legal issues was the question of does wearing armbands to school portray the uses of freedom of speech. The Supreme Court agreed with the students that the school had violated teenagers' First Amendment rights. In conclusion, students are also citizens, therefore they were also entitled to freedom of speech. Third case, Hazelwood School District v. Kohlmeyer, 1988. This case started when the editor of a school newspaper, Kathy Kohlmeyer, and two other reporters sued the school for violating their freedom of speech. One of the legal issues was if the First Amendment protected school-sponsored news articles from censorship of school administrators. The school did pay for the printing and the academic advisor's salary, so they do feel that they had the right to reject an article on teen pregnancy and divorce. The outcome of this case was in favor of the school. They say that since it was a school-sponsored activity, the officials have the right to limit what goes on their paper. In conclusion, school officials are allowed to censor school-sponsored newspapers or articles as long as it's fair. Fourth case, District of Columbia v. Heller, 2008. The Firearms Control Regulation Act was passed in 1975. This act controlled residents from carrying concealed weapons in public places, and guns on private property must be disassembled or trigger locked. A local police officer found this unfair and claimed it goes against their Second Amendment rights, so he went to court. One of the legal issues was if local laws prohibited handgun ownership, it violated Second Amendment rights. The outcome of this case was that Officer Richard Heller was correct. Individuals may carry a handgun to use under lawful purposes, such as self-defense. In conclusion, local governments may not ban private or concealed weapons used for self-defense, but they may control licensing procedures. Fifth case, Gideon v. Wainwright, 1963. A man named Clarence Gideon robbed the pool hall of his jukebox. Gideon was then faced with a jail sentence but couldn't afford an attorney. He asked for one, but they said they could only give him a lawyer if he faced a death penalty. He then tried to defend himself, but was sentenced to 5 years in prison, where he made his appeal. One legal issue to this case is if the Sixth Amendment requires courts to provide a lawyer to the defendant. The outcome was that the government must provide a lawyer to any defendant who can't afford one. The importance of this case is that states now must provide lawyers to defendants charged with felonies who cannot afford one. Sixth case, Miranda v. Arizona, 1966. A man named Ernesto Miranda was arrested in 1963 for kidnapping and rape. The police questioned him and finally he confessed. The problem was that the police never read him his rights, that he doesn't need to say anything. One legal issue is if the police can interrogate a suspect without informing him or her of his or her rights. The outcome was that the Supreme Court overturned Miranda's conviction because he was not informed of his rights, that he does not have to self-incriminate himself. The new established rights, Miranda rights, now must be read to a suspect before interrogation, or else self-incrimination may not be used in court. Seventh case, Henry Galt, 1967. Gerald Galt, 15 years old, was accused of making a dangerous/inappropriate phone call. He was then arrested and taken to juvenile detention. Galt was not benefited with an attorney or other fair due process procedures. One legal issue is if due process is guaranteed to minors. The outcome was that the juvies are still entitled to reasonable due process procedures. The significance of this case was that the state required to provide underage kids with procedures of due process guaranteed by the Constitution. Eighth case, Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896. In 1890, a law passed by Louisiana called the Jim Crow Law made railroad companies to provide equal but separate passenger cars. Someone named Homer Plessy, a 1/8 African American, wasn't allowed on the white car. He was forced to go to the black car. He went to court to fight the unfairness of the situation. The legal issue was if a state can impose racial segregation by offering separate but equal places without violating the 14th Amendment. The outcome was that the separation of races did not violate the 14th Amendment. As a result of this case, states near the South strengthened their segregation laws. Ninth case, Brown v. Board of Education, 1954. A while after Plessy v. Ferguson, white and black children still continued to go to separate schools. The father of a young school child, Mr. Brown, sued the school board because his daughter was forced to go to an all-black school. Meanwhile, the white school was closer. The legal issue was if racial segregation in public schools violated the 14th Amendment. The outcome was that racial segregation in public schools does violate the 14th Amendment. The significance of this case is that the South signed a petition against this case, which led to more violence in the South. Eventually, after a while, the nation started to carry out the known decision to take steps toward ending racial segregation. 10th case, United States v. Nixon, 1974. In the elections of 1972, a category of former government agents invaded the Democratic Party headquarters. President Nixon protected these people by saying they were acting for national security. It turns out that Nixon had taped all his conversations in the White House. He then refused to give up the tapes to investigators and said he had executive privilege. The legal issue is if executive privilege excuses the president from giving up evidence needed in a criminal investigation. The outcome of this case is that Nixon's executive privilege was ruled against by the Supreme Court, who forced Nixon to give them the tapes. The significance of this case is that Nixon was behind the Watergate cover-up. Nixon was about to get impeached when he resigned from his presidency. This case showed that no one is above the law. 11th and last case, Bush v. Gore. During the year 2020, America had a close presidential election. That when people went to sleep, the president was still yet to be known. But when all the votes came in, there was still confusion on who won the state of Florida. Vice President Al Gore of Texas, Governor George W. Bush, the winner of Florida's votes, was still set back to a delusion that happened in the counting of the votes. Specifically on paper ballots, a recount was issued in districts because of argued votes. Because of this, George W. Bush asked to stop the recount. Florida Supreme Court ruled against Bush and instructed a count by hand of every single ballot in the state. One legal issue of this case is if it violated the Equal Protection Clause and due process rights of the 14th Amendment. The decision was a 5-4 vote. This stopped the recount from taking place. The significance of this case is that George W. Bush won Florida's electoral votes and won the presidency. Al Gore did win the popular vote, but in order to become president, you must win the electoral votes.